In this section, we'll be talking about network topology. For our architecture, we're using a hub and spoke topology where we're taking advantage of something called peering, where we connect the hub location through all the spokes. Our architecture will look like this. You can see here that I have this central location, so the hub location, with some services that can be used by the various spokes. And then in our use case here, I have a spoke that would represent, let's say, a different business unit, and then a spoke that represents our AKS cluster. So why would we go with this versus the traditional way where we would have everything, let's say, in the same VNet? There are some reasons why you would want something like that. One of which is there's a concept in the cloud adoption framework called a landing zone. And with a landing zone, what we can have is a separation of duties. One of the interesting ideas that come out of that is that, let's say we have to allow remote access to our cluster. Well, we can do that, and what we have here actually allows for that. In our use case, we're using Azure Bastion as a hub to allow for that access. This concept here again of hub and spoke also minimizes really direct exposure of Azure resources to the public internet. Now, as we have here, traffic that, let's say, it's hitting our workload in our Kubernetes cluster would have to flow here through the web application firewall, which in our case is using the V2 SKU of the application gateway with a WAF in place. The traffic then would go and hit an internal load balancer, and then from the internal load balancer, we're terminating that inside of a pod with traffic here as the ingress controller. We'll touch base on that in a different video. Now, what happens, that's traffic coming and being initiated from the internet, from a user into our cluster. The way traffic would flow from, let's say, a cluster initiated connection out to the internet, so egress traffic, would be as follows. So if we just change the color here, we would go from our cluster, so from the cluster up to the peering, and then would outbound through the Azure firewall. You can then inspect traffic because this is all being funneled through the Azure firewall. Same would happen with a different spoke here. So suppose you have a different business unit and a virtual machine needs to access the internet. You can also do the same thing. You can funnel this through Azure and then go through the Azure firewall, or even an on-premise device that needs to access the internet. You can also do that. It is interesting that we can do that because we can also have localized resources in the hub, let's say DNS, for instance, where your on-prem and your other spokes could use. Now, if we go back in the hub here, I'm just going to clear my screen for us here and remove all that. Okay, so if we go back to the hub here, what we have there in our example are three different subnets. The first subnet here, this one, it's the one for the Azure firewall. Again, outbound traffic getting away from our infrastructure, whether that's in Azure or even coming from the on-prem, can flow through that. The second one is, I'm just going to change the color here so it's a little clear for us, is the use of Bastion. Now, with Bastion, Bastion is a service that allows remote access to resources in Azure. So one of the things that we can do here is provide, let's say, SSH access to VMs or remote desktop to Windows-based VMs. That can be done through Bastion here for management. And then the third one in the picture here is the gateway. So with the VPN gateway here, we could have, and that's the example we do have here, is something like an IPsec a site-to-site VPN back down to our on-premise devices. So we've accommodated that in our hub. The other thing that we do see here, so as we move down and we look at the spoke now, in the spoke, what do we have? Well, we have one subnet here being used for an internal load balancer. And again, we'll touch base on this specifically in a different video, but there is a subnet carved out for this Azure internal load balancer that is managed by AKS. You also have a subnet here for the web application firewall and a separate subnet that was carved out for the cluster itself. So that's for AKS. With this, what we have really is control between all of the subnets. We can actually apply more control if we want to. We can see that for the cluster down here, we do have a separate address space for this, where things like traffic will run and all our pods will run as well. And then we have a private link connection to other resources, in our case here, Key Vault and the Azure Container Registry. There is more information. This is just really scratching the surface around what Hub and Spoke can do. I will leave here a link in the description of this video about where you can find more information on this topic.